The headlines flashed like lightning across every major network. Traore's secret $10 billion oil deal with Russia exposed. Anchors stumbled over their words, analysts gripped their papers with trembling hands, and the glow of breaking news banners painted the world in red urgency. What was whispered in closed corridors only hours before now burst into the open, sending shockwaves from Washington to Paris, from Brussels to London. Inside boardrooms, men in tailored suits stared at each other with faces drained of color. Phones buzzed incessantly, screens lit up with frantic messages. Is this confirmed? How much leverage does he hold now? An emergency meeting was called in the West. Maps of Africa projected on massive screens, numbers flashing, voices rising. The calm veneer of power cracked. And yet, half a world away, in the heart of Africa, the mood was entirely different. Streets erupted in cheers. Crowds gathered, waving flags and chanting Traore's name with pride that thundered louder than any statement. For them, this was not just business, it was vindication. A continent long treated as a marketplace for others' profit had found a champion bold enough to play the global game on his own terms. The contrast could not be sharper. Western leaders whispered about sanctions, containment, and damage control, while African youth danced in the streets, declaring this the dawn of a new era. A single deal had redrawn the map of influence, shifting gravity away from those who had clutched it for centuries. Commentators called it reckless. Supporters called it revolutionary. But everyone agreed on one truth. Ibrahim Traoré had just changed the rules. And as the headlines rippled across the globe, one question pulsed beneath the noise. How had a leader so young, from a nation dismissed as peripheral, orchestrated a move with such seismic impact? This was no ordinary contract. It was a declaration, one that challenged centuries of exploitation, one that dared the world to reckon with a rising Africa. But this was only the beginning. The details of the deal would leave the entire world stunned. For decades, Africa's story had been told in one suffocating refrain: dependence. Western aid packages framed as gifts, yet burdened with conditions that kept nations tethered. Loans that promised development, but delivered debt. Oil and gas extracted by foreign giants who raked in billions, while local communities remained in darkness. The script was written, rehearsed, and repeated so often that the world assumed it could never be rewritten. But in one stroke, Ibrahim Traoré threatened to tear that script apart. The $10 billion oil deal was not simply about barrels and pipelines. It was about power. Who owned it, who dictated its flow, and who profited from it. For the first time, Africa was not knocking on the door of global markets as a supplicant. It was sitting at the table, hand extended, dictating terms. The West had long monopolized energy, using it as leverage to punish or reward nations that aligned with their agenda. Sanctions became weapons, aid became carrots, and Africa was cast as the eternal recipient, never the negotiator. But Traoré's move shattered that illusion. By partnering with Russia, a nation willing to sidestep the traditional chokeholds of global finance, Burkina Faso signaled something bigger. Africa no longer needed permission. This was why the deal mattered so deeply. It wasn't just the billions, it was the precedent. If one African nation could break free from the iron grip of Western-controlled energy markets, what stopped others from following? What stopped an entire continent from rewriting its destiny? Commentators on state media in Europe spoke with urgency, their tones sharper than usual. This is destabilizing, they warned. It undermines the rules-based order. But beneath the polished language lay a single fear: Control was slipping. And in Africa, the emotional shift was electric. For decades, leaders had been cornered into begging bowls, smiling politely as they signed away resources for pennies. But now the language had changed. For decades, Africa begged, one young activist shouted into a microphone at a rally. Now it is Africa who negotiates. The crowd roared, echoing her words until they became a chant that rippled across radios, televisions, and phones. Russia, of course, saw an opportunity, not just in oil, but in alliances. Willing to bypass sanctions, willing to challenge old systems, willing to play the role of partner rather than overseer. That willingness made all the difference. Western officials feared a domino effect. If Burkina Faso could leverage its oil into independence, what would stop Nigeria, Angola, or even smaller nations from doing the same? Each day, the deal was dissected in think tanks, policy briefings, and late-night television debates. The consensus was clear. This wasn't just a deal. It was a declaration of war on an old order. And yet, even as panic spread in one part of the world, something else was stirring in another. Hope. For every African watching, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't just Traore's victory. It was theirs. But what happened next changes everything, and no one saw it coming. The villains of this story did not arrive with chains and whips this time. They came with contracts, boardrooms, and promises wrapped in diplomatic smiles. For decades, Western oil corporations, backed by the iron hand of the IMF and World Bank, ruled Africa's resources with the same arrogance as old colonial powers. They declared themselves partners in progress, but the progress was always one-sided. Unfair contracts became the first weapon. Multinational giants strutted into African capitals with briefcases and legal teams, offering development opportunities. Yet, hidden deep within the legal jargon were clauses that stripped nations of sovereignty. Countries were locked into decades-long agreements where oil, gas, and minerals flowed outward at bargain prices, while profits ballooned in faraway capitals. A barrel of African oil might fetch billions abroad, but the villages where it was drilled remained in darkness, with schools underfunded and hospitals bare. Environmental destruction followed like a shadow. Rivers poisoned with oil spills, fertile farmlands turned barren, forests razed for pipelines. Communities protested, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of machines and the weight of foreign influence. When the people rose too loudly, local governments, corrupted by the same corporations, silenced them with tear gas and bullets. The cycle of plunder and suppression was perfected. And looming above it all stood the IMF and World Bank. These institutions, cloaked in the language of development aid and stability, acted as the financial enforcers of a modern empire. They extended loans with conditions so suffocating that nations found themselves paying back more in interest than they had ever borrowed. Budgets for healthcare and education were slashed to service debts, while foreign consultants lectured African leaders about fiscal responsibility. The hypocrisy was staggering. The West preached democracy, freedom, and human rights from their podiums. But in Africa, their policies told another story: dependency, control, and subjugation. They championed free markets, yet manipulated trade to ensure Africa could only sell raw resources while buying back expensive finished goods. They celebrated transparency, but turned a blind eye as their corporations bribed corrupt elites to sign away entire oil fields. These elites, Africa's own betrayers, became the local face of exploitation. Politicians and generals who lived in palaces funded by kickbacks while their people languished in poverty. They smiled for cameras, boasting about foreign partnerships, even as they signed documents that chained their nations to endless debt and dependency. They flew in private jets bought with money skimmed off oil contracts, while mothers walked miles just to fetch clean water. But cracks were beginning to show. Despite their wealth, Western oil corporations were losing legitimacy. The environmental disasters they left behind became impossible to ignore. Videos of children playing in rivers slick with oil went viral, sparking outrage. The IMF and World Bank faced mounting criticism for trapping countries in debt spirals. Even the elites who once thrived on bribes found themselves despised by their own people. Arrogance had carried the villains for decades. They believed Africa would always be too weak, too divided, too dependent to resist. They believed their stranglehold was eternal. But history was shifting beneath their feet. A new generation of Africans, younger, bolder, unafraid of colonial shadows, was rising. They saw the hypocrisy clearly, and they demanded a new path. Still, the empire tightened its grip. Sanctions threatened any country that dared step out of line. Western media painted rebellious leaders as dictators, even when they were elected by their people. The same playbook, used over and over again, seemed unbreakable. Yet behind closed doors, panic flickered. The old order was not as invincible as it appeared. And into this storm walked Ibrahim Traoré, ready to tear the mask off the empire. Ibrahim Traoré did not grow up with privilege. He was born into the dust and heat of Burkina Faso, a child of the soil who understood hunger, drought, and the quiet dignity of survival. His childhood was marked not by luxury, but by resilience, the kind of resilience only those who have faced hardship can understand. While Western leaders polished their speeches in ivy-covered halls, Traoré was learning what it meant to carry water for miles, to study by candlelight, to see families torn apart by poverty that wasn't born of laziness, but of centuries of exploitation. Those early years shaped him. He saw, with eyes too young yet too sharp, the stark contradiction of his country. A land rich in gold, cotton, and resources, yet his people were poor. Trucks carrying raw materials thundered past villages where children had no shoes. Foreign companies flaunted their presence in gleaming offices, while the locals were told to be grateful for trickles of aid. The injustice seared itself into him like a scar. When he joined the military, it wasn't for power or prestige, it was for service. The army offered education, discipline, and the chance to fight for something greater than himself. But even there, the shadows of foreign influence followed him. He saw how international powers courted African generals, showering them with favors to ensure loyalty. He saw weapons pour in from abroad, not to defend his country, but to guard interests that served no African but themselves.
Sovereignty, but to control it. And he saw soldiers, his brothers in arms, paid less than what Western consultants pocketed in a day. As he rose through the ranks, Traoré developed a reputation. He was disciplined, incorruptible, and fiercely loyal to his people. In a sea of compromised leaders, he stood apart. He refused bribes, turned down offers, and rejected shortcuts. His comrades respected him, not because of his title, but because of his integrity. And for young Africans, disillusioned with the constant betrayal of their leaders, this mattered. He wasn't another elite in a suit. He was one of them, the son of the land, a soldier who carried the same scars they did. But his rise was not without sacrifice. Traoré made enemies quickly. Corrupt officials despised him because he could not be bought. Foreign envoys whispered his name in frustration, branding him too radical, when all he asked for was dignity. Even within his own ranks, betrayal lurked. Allies turned away, fearing the wrath of the empire. There were nights when his vision for a free Africa seemed impossible, when the weight of history pressed down so heavily it nearly crushed him. Still he persisted. Every betrayal only hardened his resolve. Every threat only confirmed what he already knew, that the system was built to keep Africa on its knees. If he was to break it, he would have to be fearless. For the young, his rise was electrifying. Here was a man barely in his 30s, standing against titans who had ruled the world for centuries. He looked like them, spoke like them, carried their pain and their pride. In Traore, they saw not just a leader, but a mirror of themselves. The possibility that Africa's future could be different if only someone dared to defy the odds. His speeches didn't sound like rehearsed performances. They sounded like conversations at the dinner table, like the voice of a brother who understood. And when he finally stepped into power, it wasn't because he schemed for it. It was because people believed in him. They rallied to him not for promises of wealth, but for promises of dignity. They saw in him a leader who would not sell their future for foreign aid or bow under the weight of Western threats. He was, in every sense, their voice. The risks were staggering. By opposing the old order, he invited assassinations, coups, and sanctions. He knew that. History was littered with African leaders who dared to rise, only to be crushed by the empire's might. But he also knew something else. Silence was no longer an option. To live as a servant was a slower death than to risk everything for freedom. This contrast between his integrity and the corruption of the elites made his story almost mythic. While they dined in luxury and signed away resources, he ate simply and stood guard over his people. While they smiled for Western cameras, he looked into the eyes of his citizens and spoke uncomfortable truths. His life itself became a rebellion. And so, Ibrahim Traoré rose, not as a puppet of foreign powers, not as another politician fattened by bribes, but as a son of Africa, shaped by its struggles, ready to defend its dignity. He carried the weight of generations who had been silenced, exploited, and dismissed. This was no ordinary man. This was the man who would soon face down the most powerful nations on earth and win. The whispers began in hushed corridors long before the headlines exploded. Diplomats in tailored suits shuffled into backroom meetings, their voices low, their faces pale with urgency. What was unfolding in Burkina Faso was not just another minor shift in African politics. It was a tremor that threatened to crack the very foundation of Western dominance. Secret negotiations sprung up like wildfire. In Paris, in Washington, in Brussels, officials huddled late into the night. Phone calls were made at ungodly hours, emissaries dispatched with vague promises and veiled threats. They spoke of partnerships, of mutual interests, but beneath the polished language lurked desperation. For decades, Africa had been the open vault of the world. Now one leader threatened to shut it shut. Traoré knew the game well. Offers flooded his desk. Investment packages wrapped in ribbon, promises of aid that sounded generous on paper but always came with invisible chains. Behind those offers came the darker tactics, subtle bribes, whispers of exile if he played along, whispers of death if he did not. Every pressure point was pressed. But Traoré refused to blink. His calm unsettled them more than anger ever could. In meetings where seasoned leaders tried to corner him with their authority, he sat unshaken, his silence heavier than any speech. He listened. He measured. He answered with precision, like a chess player moving pieces across the board where every move could decide the fate of millions. Western leaders grew desperate. Threats sharpened. Sanctions were drafted in secret. Intelligence operatives monitored his every move, waiting for a crack in his resolve. Yet day after day, Traore remained steady. He was not naive, he knew the dangers, but his composure carried a message louder than words. Burkina Faso would not bend.
The tension was cinematic, a standoff that stretched like a wire pulled taut. Every statement from Traore, every counter-statement from Western capitals felt like the slow march of a drum before the explosion of battle. To his supporters, he was the embodiment of Africa's long-suppressed voice, finally refusing to be silenced. To his enemies, he was a threat that had to be neutralized, quickly. The pressure mounted. International media painted him as reckless, too young, too radical, an outlier bound to fail. Behind those headlines, however, ordinary Africans saw the truth. They saw a man who, unlike the elites before him, did not bow under Western glare. Social media buzzed with anticipation. Rumors flew. Was Traore about to make a move that could shatter decades of control? Every day felt like a countdown. Western capitals thought he would eventually break. They waited for fatigue, for hesitation, for one wrong step they could exploit. But Traore gave them nothing. His stillness became a weapon. His refusal to be baited made the powerful appear weak. The chess match dragged on, and every passing moment tilted the board in his favor. Inside Burkina Faso, the air was electric. Ministers aligned with the West grew restless, some even plotting behind closed doors. But the people, the farmers, the youth, the soldiers, stood behind Traore. They saw his calm not as weakness, but as courage, the kind of courage their forefathers had dreamed of. And so the tension spiraled. The world held its breath, waiting to see who would make the first decisive strike. Would the West tighten its grip with sanctions? Would Traore retreat under pressure? No, the silence was about to break, because just when the balance of power seemed most fragile, Traore made his move. And then came the move no one saw coming. The hall was silent, yet charged, like the air before a storm. Cameras clicked, journalists leaned forward, and officials from across the globe adjusted their earpieces, waiting for Ibrahim Traoré to speak. They expected hesitation, perhaps a carefully rehearsed statement that could be spun, dissected, and diluted by Western press. But what they did not expect was a thunderclap. Traore stepped up to the podium, his uniform sharp, his voice steady, his eyes piercing through the glare of the lights. He did not clear his throat. He did not shuffle his notes. He simply began. Burkina Faso, he declared, pausing for a heartbeat, will no longer beg for crumbs from the tables of those who built their empires on our suffering. A murmur spread through the hall. Some gasped. Others scoffed, but Traore pressed forward, his tone calm but unyielding. For too long, our continent has been treated as a colony without chains. You come with your aid, your loans, your contracts, each one disguised as generosity, but all designed to keep us weak. Those days are over. Today, I stand before you not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign. The words cut through the room like a blade. Diplomats shifted in their seats. Western envoys scribbled notes furiously, unsure whether to interrupt, object, or simply wait for the storm to pass. And then came the hammer blow. This morning, Traore said, his voice rising with deliberate force, Burkina Faso has signed a historic agreement, a $10 billion oil deal with the Russian Federation. 10 billion, not in the language of exploitation, not in the terms dictated by the IMF or the World Bank, but on equal footing, sovereign to sovereign. The hall erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Flashes burst like lightning. Some officials stood in shock. Others whispered in alarm. Western delegates turned red, their polished masks cracking under the weight of disbelief. The deal was real, and it had been done behind their backs. Traore did not flinch. He let the chaos roar for a moment before raising his hand. Silence fell again, uneasy, reluctant. This agreement bypasses the systems designed to choke us. No middlemen in Paris, no approval needed from Washington, no signatures from Brussels. For the first time in our history, we control the flow of our resources and we decide who benefits. And make no mistake, it will be the people of Africa who benefit. The words hung heavy, electric. For ordinary Africans watching on screens, in homes, on phones across the continent, it was more than a deal. It was vindication. It was proof that a leader could look the West in the eye and say no, and mean it. He paused, letting the crowd lean into the silence. His next words came softer, but sharper.
They called us too poor to govern ourselves, too divided to negotiate, too desperate to refuse. But today, they learn that Africa is not desperate. Africa is awake, and Africa is no longer theirs to command. The audience split, gasps on one side, thunderous applause on the other. Young Africans erupted with cheers, waving flags, recording the moment on their phones. Western leaders sat stone-faced, their authority shrinking under the weight of every word. Traore leaned forward, his voice now a measured fire. You spoke of freedom while you chained us with debt. You preached democracy while you supported dictators who bowed to you. You poisoned our rivers, stripped our land, and called it development. Today, I say to you, the mask has fallen. The empire is naked. The hall quivered. Even seasoned diplomats who had weathered decades of political storms could feel it. This was not rhetoric. It was rupture. A tectonic shift was underway, and they were sitting in its epicenter. Traore did not deliver a speech. He delivered a reckoning. Every pause was a dagger. Every sentence was history. Our farmers will no longer sell their crops for pennies while you sell them for gold. Our oil will no longer fill your tanks while our people walk barefoot. Our youth will no longer die in deserts and seas because you robbed their future at home. We are done, and this deal is the proof that the chains are broken. The crowd erupted once more. Some chanted his name, others raised their fists in solidarity. Across Africa, from Dakar to Nairobi, hashtags lit up. Hashtag Africa Rises. Streets filled with cheers as citizens watched the broadcast live. Meanwhile, in Washington, emergency meetings were called. In Paris, ministers fumbled for statements. In Brussels, silence reigned, broken only by the frantic tapping of keyboards, drafting condemnations. The empire, once unshakable, now looked cornered, small, fragile. But Traore was not done. He delivered the final strike with the calm of a man who knew history was on his side. This is not only about Burkina Faso. This is about every African nation tired of begging, tired of bleeding, tired of being told to wait. We will build partnerships that respect us, that honor us, that allow us to stand tall. And if that frightens the old powers, let them tremble, because we are not asking for permission. We are taking our freedom. The hall shook with applause, so loud it seemed to rattle the very walls. Western officials sat frozen, unable to mask their disbelief. This was not just defiance, it was declaration. Traore stepped back from the podium, his eyes scanning the room, letting the image burn itself into memory. A young leader, unbroken, standing tall as the empire crumbled around him. It was a cinematic moment, the kind etched into the collective memory of a generation. For the West, it was humiliation. For Africa, it was rebirth. The deal was not simply a transaction. It was a symbol that the monopoly was over, that the narrative had changed, that history would not be written in Western ink alone. The explosion had happened. But if the deal was the explosion, the shock waves that followed were the earthquake. The announcement landed like a thunderclap. One moment it was a headline scrolling across screens, the next it was a firestorm. Across Africa, phones lit up with messages, hashtags erupted in every language, and memes flooded the timelines. Clips of Traore's speech went viral, spliced with music, remixed into chants, cut into inspirational montages. Young Africans who had grown up feeling invisible in the global order suddenly saw themselves reflected in a leader who had dared to defy the empire. On Twitter, a single phrase began trending across the continent: "Africa is not for sale." On TikTok, dancers in Lagos moved to remixed soundbites of Traore declaring independence from Western control. In Kinshasa, graffiti artists painted his face towering over city walls, crowned not with gold, but with the clenched fists of the people. What had begun as one man's announcement now pulsed like electricity through the veins of a continent.
Western leaders watched with a cocktail of horror and disbelief. In Washington, the word sanctions floated through hushed rooms like an incantation. In Paris, ministers whispered of containment, as if Africa were an infection threatening to spread. Emergency meetings were called, threats were drafted, and the same tired playbook of pressure was dusted off. Yet this time, the response felt weaker, slower, less confident. For every threat issued, 10,000 African voices responded online with laughter, parodying the West's indignation. In Moscow, champagne glasses clinked. Russian state media ran triumphant broadcasts, hailing Traore as a partner in a new multipolar world. Kremlin analysts spoke with gleeful certainty. This was not just a deal, it was a domino. And in Beijing, quiet but approving nods were exchanged, calculations already underway about which nation might be next. The shockwaves didn't stop at boardrooms and parliaments. They reached the markets. Oil futures trembled. Currency traders whispered of instability. Investors, once smug in their assumption that African resources were predictable, began to sweat. The empire had cracked, and the fracture lines were visible. And yet, the most profound transformation was not in markets or headlines. It was in hearts. For decades, African youth had been told to look elsewhere for hope, to see their leaders as corrupt, their nations as fragile, their futures as exportable. But now here was a counter-narrative. Africa as powerful, Africa as united, Africa as the architect of its own destiny. Still, beneath the waves of celebration, a deeper current stirred. Not everyone cheering in the streets trusted the storm that was coming. Elders remembered what happened to leaders who defied the West: Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi. They whispered warnings. They will not forgive him. They never do. The young dismissed the caution with chants of courage, but the shadows lingered. And within the corridors of African governments, cracks appeared. Some elites, tied by contracts and loyalties to Western interests, felt the walls closing in. Could they survive if this movement spread? Would their own people rise against them? Suddenly, Traore was not just a symbol of pride. He was a threat to their entire way of life. The shockwaves had spread further than anyone could control. What had started as a deal now pulsed like a revolution waiting to erupt. But revolutions are dangerous things. They inspire, they ignite, but they also attract enemies from every direction. And as the world watched the celebrations unfold, a question hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Was this truly the dawn of African freedom, or the prelude to a storm even darker than the empire itself? Because beneath the cheers, beneath the hashtags, beneath the fire in the streets, a deeper truth was taking shape. In the end, this was never just about oil. It was never just about a $10 billion contract inked between Burkina Faso and Russia. The deal was a spark, yes, but the fire it lit revealed something far deeper. At its core, this was about dignity versus exploitation, independence versus oppression, and the eternal struggle of a people refusing to be defined by chains that were not of their making. For centuries, Africa had been spoken about as if it were a child in need of guidance, a land too wild, too fragile, too divided to chart its own path. The West wrote the narratives, controlled the headlines, dictated the contracts. Dignity was the one thing denied to millions of Africans. Dignity stolen in boardrooms, erased in speeches, buried under statistics that never captured the humanity of those who tilled the land, drilled the wells, mined the riches. And then came Ibrahim Traoré. His name, once unknown outside his nation, now stood as a symbol of resistance and renewal. In him, Africans saw not just a soldier, not just a president, but the embodiment of a shift in destiny. He had stood before the world, unflinching, and declared that Africa would not beg, would not crawl, would not surrender its birthright. He reminded his people of something they had always known in their hearts, but had been told to forget, that dignity cannot be imported, and independence cannot be granted. It must be taken. The lesson of this moment was universal. Wherever injustice persists, there is always a choice, to bend or to stand, to cower or to speak, to accept the weight of oppression or to rise and break it. Traoré's defiance was not just an African story, it was a human story. It echoed in the struggles of every people who had ever been told they were too small to matter, too weak to resist, too late to change their fate. And yet the brilliance of this turning point lay not only in its defiance, but in its affirmation. Traoré did not rise to say that Africa sought revenge. He did not rise to trade one master for another. He rose to affirm the simplest, most powerful truth, that Africa belongs to Africans, that its resources, its future, its pride are not commodities on a global market, but the soul of a people who refuse to be erased.
Every chant in the streets, every hashtag online, every mural painted in his likeness spoke the same truth. Africa's time is not tomorrow. It is now. No longer would the future be promised as a gift that never arrived. No longer would hope be deferred until the next loan, the next deal, the next generation. This was the moment to stand tall, to seize the dignity long denied, to embrace the independence long delayed. And that is why this story matters far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Because when one people rise, others see that rising is possible. When one leader defies, others discover courage within themselves. When one continent declares its worth, the world is forced to listen. The empire may try to suppress the voice, but it cannot silence the echo. The moral is clear.
No power, no matter how entrenched, is invincible when faced with people who remember their worth. Traore's example is proof that the walls of oppression, though built high, are not eternal. They crack when dignity is chosen over fear. They crumble when independence is chosen over servitude. They collapse when courage becomes more powerful than control. And so, the story of a single oil deal transformed into something greater. It became a testament to the unstoppable truth that freedom is not granted by the hand of another, but claimed by the will of the people. If this one deal could spark such fire, if one act of defiance could send shockwaves through nations, ignite protests, inspire chants, terrify empires, then imagine what's coming next. Traore's secret $10 billion oil deal with Russia exposed. That headline will be remembered not just as a story of politics, but as a story of history in motion. It was the day a small nation stood tall, the day Africa stopped asking for permission and began writing its own terms. Think of what this moment represents. It's not simply a contract on paper. It's a turning point, a declaration, a signal fire. Generations from now, people will look back and say, this was when the tide shifted. This was when the world first realized that Africa would no longer play the role it had been assigned. But history is not written by leaders alone. It is written by those who witness, those who share, those who refuse to stay silent. That means you. Every comment, every share, every voice raised online or offline becomes part of the movement. When you subscribe, you're not just clicking a button. You're standing with millions who believe in dignity over exploitation, independence over oppression. The story of Ibrahim Traoré is not just Burkina Faso's story. It is Africa's story. And in many ways, it is humanity's story. Because every people, everywhere, deserves the right to stand on equal ground. So if this one deal could spark such fire, if one act of defiance could send shockwaves through nations, ignite protests, inspire chants, terrify empires, then imagine what's coming next. Traore's secret $10 billion oil deal with Russia exposed. That headline will be remembered not just as a story of politics, but as a story of history in motion. It was the day a small nation stood tall, the day Africa stopped asking for permission and began writing its own terms. Think of what this moment represents. It's not simply a contract on paper. It's a turning point, a declaration, a signal fire. Generations from now, people will look back and say, this was when the tide shifted. This was when the world first realized that Africa would no longer play the role it had been assigned. But history is not written by leaders alone. It is written by those who witness, those who share, those who refuse to stay silent. That means you. Every comment, every share, every voice raised online or offline becomes part of the movement. When you subscribe, you're not just clicking a button. You're standing with millions who believe in dignity over exploitation, independence over oppression.